Welcome to Economics Happy Hour. My name's Matt.
And my name is Jadrian.
Brian.
And I'm Brian,
They,
back for more.
yeah, we didn't practice the cold open here, but Jadrian and I are thrilled to have Brian O'Rourke back. It is, as I think Jadrian might have mentioned in the text thread, the debate hangover edition for the group of us. Although I will caution, I don't drink excessively. Hangovers are bad. Uh, but it is 8:30 in the morning on Friday, June 28th, the night after the debate. We are going to try to get this out immediately, maybe even today if possible, but hopefully soon, as we wanted to get you our thoughts on the economics discussions on the debate. By now, you've seen plenty on the debate. Who knows what will have happened by the time this drops or by the time you're listening. But before we get to that, 8:37 in the morning, Brian, what are you drinking?
Standby screwdriver.
Okay, so you are going with a little bit of a zing and pep in the drink today.
Absolutely.
Okay, Jadrian.
I have a hot cup of coffee, but I have added some Buffalo Trace bourbon
Ooh.
cream,
Oh,
which is, I guess, a bourbon alternative to Kahlua. Had it on a Delta flight once. Absolutely love it. It is delicious. So I got a little bit in my coffee too, but I'm not working in the office, and Matt looks like he's on campus.
I'm in the office. I don't know that there's ever been a bigger disparity between the drinks that you've had and I'm about to show you. I'm at the office. I don't. As everybody knows, I love a beer. I generally don't drink in the morning anyway. So, but I am having Diet Wise Cola. It's just as exciting as the other drinks, but that's my morning caffeine right now. And
For those of you listening who didn't just see this on the YouTube channel, Matt pulled out a 2 liter of diet soda
it may not
as
be
his
all
morning.
gone today, but then again, it might.
Matt,
Depends
I
if
do.
we do.
I have a
Oh, go ahead.
follow-up. Are you drinking straight from the bottle, or are you
No,
pouring
no,
yourself?
no.
Okay.
I am pouring it into a beautiful Sigmund Wise School of Business.
Oh,
Okay, thank you. I just needed to check.
So, before we get to some of the clips, it's late June. Wouldn't say summer is halfway over, but we're getting close to that point. How have your summers been going?
I'll let Brian go first.
oh, thanks, Adrian. So, I finally, after literally after years, I finally have a book contract for a economics and Harry Potter book I'm working on. So, that is going to be due much, much, much sooner than I expected. So, that's sort of where the summer is heading right now. Although tomorrow we're leaving town, so I don't know how much I'll get work done I'll get next week. But um, and we were up in Mackinac Island last week. My wife and I went for a postponed birthday trip. We were supposed to go last fall. She came home from another trip with COVID, so we had to postpone. But um, great place to visit. Can't recommend it enough. I'm not being
Oh,
paid to say that, but it is a step back in time because if you've never been to Mackinac, there are no cars allowed on the island. So you take a boat to the island and then you're either walking, riding a bike, or taking some sort of horse-drawn transportation, which creates its own kind of environmental degradation. All the horses they have over there is
yeah.
it's they have a fleet of people to come by and sweep up after the horses all day long, every day.
Yeah, sounds other than the last part, it does
Yeah,
sound pretty cool. It does
but the
sound pretty
food is
cool.
great and the environment there is wonderful. It's really a neat
Awesome.
experience.
And Jadrian, your summer has looked great according to what I've seen.
Yeah, no, I've had a good summer. It's been a mix of working like nonstop for a week and then taking three
Mm.
or 4 days off, then working nonstop for a week, taking 3 or 4. I could smooth this out, but I'm not. So no, I've gotten to travel to Sweden and Boston and Houston. In a couple days, I'll go to Vegas.
You were in
Right,
Pittsburgh.
I was in Pittsburgh. Well, that was the Boston trip. Was me coming
Oh,
back.
okay.
I flew out of Pittsburgh. Um, got a Vegas trip coming up. Right before Jet Set, I'm going to Tampa. Um, and then right after Jet Set, I'll go to Ireland. So I've got a couple really fun trips planned. Work
Very cool.
wise, working on Jet Set.
Yeah.
That's my afternoons is getting things finalized, and it's looking like it's going to be a lot of fun. And so I'm just super excited to share all the stuff we're going to do. Hope after this episode comes out, I'll share all that information.
Yeah.
But it looks like we're going to have a really good time.
Yeah, I can't remember if when we recorded it was all official yet, but yeah, I'm excited to rejoin the Jets team as a associate editor, which I had for a while, let go of when I first came into this, but excited to be back on the Jet team. Yeah, it's been a good summer. It's been busy. I have an exciting announcement and I can't yet make it because there's an official part that's that's not, the loose ends aren't tied up. You all both know what it is, but I can't quite announce it to the public yet. But it's been a busy summer. A lot of it's been the little trips, which have been good. My wife and I just did a couple days in New York and saw a few shows that were that was a lot of fun. And then our family's actually doing a Quebec City trip next for the next probably 4 days or so. We're gonna leave Saturday, get back right before July 4th. So that should be, never been to Quebec City. I've heard it's a fascinating town. So
Never been.
cool. Well, the debate was last night. You've heard a lot. Our goal is not to try to go through the overall impressions of the debate. There are plenty of people that can talk about that, but we're going to show a number of different clips from the debate, and then we will stop and we will discuss it. So are you ready for clip number one?
I'm as ready as I can be. So
Okay.
President Biden, inflation has slowed, but prices remain high. Since you took office, the price of essentials has increased. For example, a basket of groceries that cost $100 then now costs more than $120. And typical home prices have jumped more than 30%. What do you say to voters who feel they are worse off under your presidency than they were under President Trump?
We got to take a look at what I was left when I became president and what Mr. Trump left me. We had an economy that was in free fall. The pandemic was so badly handled. Many people were dying. All he said was, it's not that serious. Just inject a little bleach into your arm. You'll be all right. The economy collapsed. There were no jobs. Unemployment rate rose to 15%. It was terrible. And so what we had to do was try to put things back together again. And that's exactly what we began to do. We created 15,000 new jobs. We brought on the position where we have 800,000 new manufacturing jobs. But there's more to be done. There's more to be done. Working class people are still in trouble. I come from Scranton, Pennsylvania. I come of a household where the kitchen table, if the things weren't able to be met during the month, it was a problem. The price of eggs, the price of gas, the price of housing, the price of a whole range of things. That's why I'm working so hard to make sure I deal with those problems. And we're going to make sure that we reduce the price of housing. We're going to make sure we build 2 million new units. We're going to make sure we cap rents so corporate greed can't take over. The combination, what I was left with in corporate greed, is the reason why we're in this problem right now. In addition to that, we're in a situation where if you take a look at all that was done in his administration, he didn't do much at all. By the time he left, things were in chaos, literally chaos. And so we put things back together. We created, I said, those jobs. We make sure we had a situation where we brought down the price of prescription drugs, which is a major issue for many people, to $15 for an insulin shot as opposed to $400. No senior has to pay more than $200 for any drug, all the drugs they can include beginning next year. And the situation is and we're going to make that available to everybody, to all Americans. So we're working to bring down the price around the kitchen table, and that's what we're going to get done.
Biden opens, clip number one. There's so much to say here. Where does somebody want to start? Where does somebody want to start?
Let me start. I'll pick the low-hanging fruit on this one, mostly because we've talked about home prices before. I'm going to pick the easy one, and I will verify that the inflation portion is accurate. When I first heard it, I was like, that seems like a lot. And I went and checked it.
What inflation part? What did he say?
Prices have gone up 20% since the start of Biden's administration. At first, I was like, that doesn't feel right. It felt higher than I was expecting, but I went and I looked at the CPI. If you start the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, at the start of his term, and you look at it today, it's 20% higher. I will say something to keep in mind is that generally inflation hits every president. And so it's important to see sort of how does that compare to when Trump started. It is much higher because we've hit just a massive amount of inflation. So I also went back and looked because I was curious. If you go to the start of Trump's term, 2016, to the end at 2020, prices under his administration went up about 9%. So sort of as a comparison, it's 9% versus what we're seeing is 20%. Um, but I would say that's part was an easy check that I was accurate, higher than what I think most people are used to seeing. Not as surprising. So I'll take the easy one and say, yeah, prices are higher.
Okay.
I think
Is
we all
it,
know that. That was not a surprising claim, I think, for most things.
Yeah, yeah. Anything more on inflation from there, Brian?
No, they really, I mean, I guess the things that, if you want to talk about reducing inflation, some of the stuff that he mentioned isn't going to reduce inflation.
Right.
Well, I mean, maybe it will, but it's not going to cause, it's not going to solve any problems. The one thing that really jumped out to me as far as a policy suggestion was the idea of putting
Yes.
caps on rent.
Yeah.
I thought, ooh, dude, that's that's principles of economics. You put caps on rent, the people who get the capped prices are happy, but the people who can't find housing, they're not happy at all. And maybe they have to go out and look either further away from where they live, or they're living with roommates or they're living with their parents, and that's bad policy. And it seems like no matter what administration tries that, Republican or Democrat, it always ends badly. But it's something that if people had more economic education, they might understand.
Yeah, that part's concerning. And I don't know, maybe a listener or maybe either of you can chime in. I don't know of a single town, city, municipality that has instituted rent control where rents have then been controlled. I don't know of it ever happening. And there are plenty of cases to the contrary. Yeah, he said that. He also, on inflation, he mentioned there's corporate greed. He didn't say the word greedflation, which has come out some, but that has always struck me as like, come on, people. Corporations, yeah, they're greedy. And they were greedy now. I think they were greedy before. I'm greedy. We're all greedy, right? We all want what's best for us. I don't, in order to buy into the corporate greed causing the inflation, you'd either have to think the corporations got greedier or there was some essential thing in the economy that changed that allowed them to harness their greed a little bit better. And neither of those seem very likely to me. So that's the thought on inflation. Do you have other comments on the opening one, this opening clip?
I'll share go ahead, Brian, go.
So I was going to say, the idea of bringing down the price of insulin, I think is an interesting kind of thought, because that price was really, really high. And this gets to the idea of, can government insert itself as a large buyer and use its bargaining power to really reduce prices? And I think they can. I mean, I think that is a legitimate attempt by a government to sort of working through the market to say, hey, look, you should be cutting us a deal. We are an enormous buyer. And this happens all the time with other businesses. Why government wouldn't want to insert itself in that way to try to lower prices? I think that's a fair point as far as bringing prices down.
I think I've been a fan of that, because it's something that, we talk about. I think most textbooks have insulin in their textbooks as examples of, elasticities, and it pops up in patents and all sorts it pops up in lots of places. And so I think from a teaching standpoint, that was a big one that I think got sort of brushed aside really quickly. Although you're right, you could argue that that's a price control on a product that, as far as I can tell, we haven't seen sort of the massive we haven't seen shortages that we would expect in like a housing market, because they're two very different markets. What I was surprised he didn't mention, which was a really big component of his administration, is all of sort of the monopsony fighting type stuff that he has pitched over the past 2 years. Things like ending non-competes, going after sort of monopoly power that the Justice Department has done. He has put out, I want to say, multiple executive orders, I think at least three, sort of in this space of increasing competition in the workplace, which we would normally assume is going to drive down prices. We usually assume that competition does that. I was surprised throughout the entire 90 minutes. I don't think he ever mentioned that.
No, he
And
didn't.
if you want to talk about sort of the economic explanation of how do we get prices, if you really do want prices lower, right? I think we've shared before this idea of inflation coming down does not mean prices are coming down. If you really want to talk about driving prices down, I don't think the solution is rent control, price controls on products. It's competition. It's competition. And so I think that's where I wish he would have talked more about that.
Yeah, it's yeah, I think you're right. He didn't mention that. Kind of a final thing
The
I'll
entire
mention
90
on
minutes.
yeah. A final thing I'll mention, I think, on this, he mentions 15% unemployment rate, and he mentioned it later as well. It did reach a peak of 15%, but that one, I think a fact check meter, he implied he took over when it was 15%. It had dropped to under 7%, I believe, by the time he took office. So that one, yeah, it did spike to 15%, but I mean, the unemployment rate was 25 in the Great Depression. He's not going to comment on that either. But I think that was a little bit of perhaps.
Let me chime in I think I agree. Absolutely. I agree. It's almost unfair. I'm going to say it's unfair to President Trump to say that he left behind 15% unemployment, but then you have this sort of reverse argument whenever they talk about like gas prices, for example. So Trump loves to talk about how, gas prices were $1.80 when he left because of the pandemic. And then everybody will say, "Oh no, that was because of the pandemic. He didn't do that." But that flip on the unemployment rate, like that 15%, that was not policy-based reasons we had 15% unemployment.
Yeah.
That was because of the pandemic. So I'm going to say that's an unfair sort of comparison. I'm also surprised gas prices never popped up in the debate. You want to talk about prices around the home. It's groceries, gas prices, and utility bills. Instead, he pivots to, I don't think they talked about grocery prices at all. He pivots to rent and medicine as the two that he kind of hit on. I think most Americans, when they're mad about prices, it's what they fill up at the gas tank. It's what they buy at the grocery store. And it's what the stock market is doing to their retirement account.
Yeah.
Those three things, from what I remember, it was a late night. It was way past my bedtime. I don't think those got mentioned.
I think you're right. Although Trump gets a chance to respond, I think if we could probably keep talking about this first 2 minutes for a while, but
I think so.
We're trying to hold it to a reasonable length. I'll go to Trump's response.
We're the greatest
right now.
economy in the history of our country. We have never done so well. Everybody was amazed by it. Other countries were copying us. We got hit with COVID. And when we did, we spent the money necessary so we wouldn't end up in a Great Depression, the likes of which we had in 1929. By the time we finished, so we did a great job. We got a lot of credit for the economy, a lot of credit for the military, and no wars, and so many other things. Everything was rocking good. But the thing we never got the credit for, and we should have, is getting us out of that COVID mess. He created mandates that was a disaster for our country. But other than that, we had given them back a country where the stock market actually was higher than pre-COVID, and nobody thought that was even possible. The only jobs he created are for illegal immigrants and bounce back jobs, a bounce back from the COVID. He has not done a good job. He's done a poor job, and inflation's killing our country. It is absolutely killing us.
Thank you. President Biden?
Well, look, the greatest economy in the world. He's the only one who thinks that, I think. I don't know anybody else who thinks he's the greatest economy in the world. And, the fact of the matter is that we found ourselves in a situation where his economy, he rewarded the wealthy. He had the largest tax cut in American history, $2 trillion. He raised a deficit larger than any president has in any one term. He's the only president other than Herbert Hoover who's lost more jobs than he had when he began, since Herbert Hoover. The idea that
Okay, Brian, you pick.
Brian, you get to start.
It's hard sometimes to separate hyperbole from fact when, in politics. And that's just part of the game here. So how do you measure the greatest economy in the world or greatest economy ever? Um, Historically, the Trump economy was really good on a lot of levels at its best. At the peak, real GDP per person was higher than it had ever been up to that point in the United States. Um, Unemployment was really low. Those are the two things that most people pay attention to. Inflation was really low before COVID happened. So, I think I think that statement is probably close enough to being correct, just by standard macro measures. But Jadrian, I think you alluded to this a little bit earlier. It's how much credit do you give the president when things are good, and how much do you give him when things are bad? It's easy to say that the economy tanks and then neglect to say that it tanked because we were all told not to go to work and everyone was terrified that there was going to be, COVID was going to kill everyone. I mean, that's just a totally, it has nothing to do with the president, just like so much of the macro economy has nothing to do with the president. But you'd be a fool not to take credit for it as the president. So, I mean, if Trump would have been in office 6 more months, it would have been a totally different story. But
So I looked up real GDP per capita while you were talking. It is higher. Yeah. It's highest. It's at the highest it's been, right?
It's higher now than it was
at
that time. Yeah.
But I think it goes back to exactly what you said. How do you define the economy? And I tell this to my students all the time. Like we use a discussion board in class. I ask students to post things connecting it to class, and my least favorite post is, how does blank affect the economy? I hate that. I always do this in class too. I go, the economy. What does that mean? Right. So I say GDP per capita, it's higher today. It doesn't mean that necessarily this is a good economy. We've talked about that. You see the inflation stuff. You see people struggling with, personal income is maybe a little bit not where we want it to be. Real household income is not where we want it to be. Matt has written very nicely reasons why the economy maybe isn't as good as we think. But which measure do you pick as the measure to say, this is a good economy versus a bad economy?
I think I'll start on my thoughts on this, starting with what is clearly wrong that Trump said. Look, the unemployment rate had dropped from the COVID peaks, but it was 6.4. I have it open now. It was 6.4% in January 2021. And it's down to, under 4%, or actually May, it looks like it's exactly at 4% now, dropped to the 3.6. The unemployment rate's down. And, it's kind of a little bit, it's the inflammatory comments to say it's jobs are for only that immigrants that are coming in. That's not true. That's simply a false statement. The unemployment rate is not at a historic low, but, in the last couple of years of the Trump administration prior to COVID, and really in the last year or so, maybe last couple of years under the Biden administration here, it's been at what I would say more or less historic lows. Could we get a little bit lower, perhaps, but it's been very, very good. So I think that was clearly an incorrect statement by Trump to start with. A fair amount of hyperbole. Curious if one thing he does mention, he spent a lot of money on the COVID relief, which is absolutely true. Did that initially, did a second round. Is that good? Should he be taking credit for that? Are there consequences we're not thinking about? He mentions it. It's about 1 second line. We spent a lot of money, and then he moves on to the next thing.
Let's focus on let's talk about the economy. Matt, I think this is a good chance. I want you to share some of what you have written recently.
Sure.
Of just sort of this idea that, I could look at the stock market. Stock market's up from 4 years ago. I could look at GDP per capita. It's up from 4 years ago. I could look at unemployment rates. They're low, consistently low. Yeah. They're not moving. They're not going down, but they're pretty stable. Matt, Can you share?
Yep.
I guess let's go on the flip side. Why
So-
would we say that this economy
Yeah.
might not
So
be great?
Yeah. Thanks for mentioning. So I promoted recent video, recent Substack post. Six, I think, metrics that are being overlooked, or six facts about the economy that are being overlooked. Interest rates aren't factored into the inflation rate. And there's decent reasons for that. But when you talk about the cost of living, if you need to take out a car loan or a mortgage and you're paying an extra percent, that is very much you are worse off, and your cost of living is up, even though that's not factored into the inflation rate. Net household net worth is pretty much constant since the start of the Biden presidency, where it was up about 15% by this time in the Trump presidency, and it ended quite a bit higher than that. The stock market is up, but it's not up as much as it was under either the Trump administration or the Biden administration. Inflation is still higher. Inflation's down, but it's still above 3%. And the decade before COVID, it never exceeded 3. And really, a lot of the time, it was below 2. So it's still higher. And Jadrian, you'd made the really good comment. It was a year and a half ago, and on one of these, that it's on a higher base. And I think I stole that. I probably should have given you credit and gone back and found that's the first. It's inflation rates went up 10% one year, and then if you have a 3% increase the next year, it's not a 3% on $100. It's a 3% on $110. So it's really could seem like a little more, and that always happens. But when you have a big spike, it will come up. The national debt was mentioned. I also think the debt per person, it's not being focused on much by voters, but it means we're either paying in more taxes or getting less services, or a combination of both. So I think there's a lot that's going on that's not great with the economy. Once again, how much credit or blame goes to any specific president is a completely different question. But I think there are reasons why there is a lot of angst about the economy, and I think they're pretty legit.
I agree.
Oh.
Thank you for sharing those. I shared it on Twitter, but because you have a Substack, Twitter doesn't like your post, so it did not go far.
No, but thank you. No, I appreciate it. Thank you for trying.
I think the next clip is the one I really am looking forward to.
You want to impose a 10% tariff on all goods coming into the U.S. How will you ensure that that doesn't drive prices even higher?
It's not going to drive them higher. It's just going to cost countries that have been ripping us off for years, like China and many others, in all fairness to China. It's going to just force them to pay us a lot of money, reduce our deficit tremendously, and give us a lot of power for other things. But he made a statement. The only thing he was right about is I gave you the largest tax cut in history. I also gave you the largest regulation cut in history. That's why we had all the jobs. And the jobs went down, and then they bounced back, and he's taking credit for bounce back jobs. You can't do that. He also said he inherited 9% inflation. Now, he inherited almost no inflation, and it stayed that way for 14 months. And then it blew up under his leadership because they spent money like a bunch of people that didn't know what they were doing, and they don't know what they were doing. It was probably the worst administration in history.
Brian,
you were looking forward to that clip.
Is that the clip?
This is the clip. Absolutely. Yeah. The idea that China is going to pay for the tariff and we're going to make all this money off of this tariff is just insane. It's stupid. it's so it just makes my head hurt. I mean, when you put this is the thing they complain about with businesses. You know, they pass everything on to consumers, and the businesses in China are the ones who pay the tariff, and they will pass that on to consumers. And it's for consumer goods, it's for inputs. It's going to make this is the thing that if you're worried about inflation, this is. And I'm looking at it strictly from an economic point of view. So I understand there's politics here as well. But this is the thing that's really, it's going to make inflation worse. And there have been estimates about how much worse. And, the estimates are, they range, over a pretty wide spectrum. But this is a terrible idea. And not only that, of course, and Trump mentioned the Great Depression. And one of the things we always teach about with the Great Depression is when the United States put the tariff in place, what does everybody else do? They raise their tariffs against our products. And so it hurts our domestic manufacturers who are trying to sell goods overseas. This is an absolute absolutely terrible idea from any perspective on the economic front.
Listen, I don't know how much more I can add to that, Matt. Like I would say the easiest way to think about it is that there are Chinese businesses that are selling things in the United States that will be taxed. But there's also a lot of American businesses that import stuff from China. They go get things, bring them here, and then sell them to us. Exactly what Brian said. I think if you look, there's always the argument against like higher minimum wages. Oh, you're going to raise the minimum wage, they're going to pass that on to you, you're going to pay more for your hamburger. What do you think tariffs are going to do? They're not just going to eat that. They're going to share that. They're going to, you're going to pay higher prices. And the other companies are going to say, you know what? Look at I can sell it for less, but I don't need to sell it for that much less. They're selling it for 10% more. Let me sell mine for 5% more. I don't think, I mean, I think this is one of those things that given everything we know about most policies, I could actually probably sit, I don't love price ceilings. I don't love rent control. I can make some arguments for why some protections might help. Like you can see some benefits. Man, tariffs though, that has to be one of the policies that is the least popular because of how destructive that is across the entire country. I think you could at least say, rent control maybe hit some cities harder than others. Some people won't be affected. Tariffs hit everybody.
Yeah.
That is the entire exactly what Brian said. It hits inputs that are going to turn into outputs. That hits products that we all purchase. That everybody pays in that sense.
Yeah. I disagree with you on the. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
Oh, so you said it's the least popular for tariffs. I think it's important
you-
to say it's
could you
least
pick a
popular
different-
among economists.
Sorry. Among economists.
Because there are lots of people who are going to say,
sorry.
kill
Yes.
China, get China.
Among economists.
Yeah.
Matt, I know you're going to pick, maybe there's a different policy, but man, tariffs are the ones where I just roll my eyes that they're just.
I would think
bad.
rent control's worse. I don't disagree with anything you're saying on tariffs. I mean, one of the most fundamental things we teach really in all principles of economics, especially in macro, we go through a lot of the analytics, is trade is good.
Mhm.
And the only reason trade happens is it's a voluntary exchange. So both parties are better off and the production and consumption possibilities go up. Two facts on this, I think that we both agree on. One, a tariff is a tax. So if you want to talk about how you're not increasing taxes, this is a tax and it will go to the American public. Now, how much of a split? Could Chinese firms pay some of this? Yeah, they could.
Yes.
But American consumers will 100% be paying for a portion of the tariff. And that doesn't even factor in potential retaliation, which will harm American companies a lot. Second,
Largely
the idea that this will
farmers, I think, is the big one. If I remember from the previous ones, it's our agricultural industry that gets hit the hardest on our exports.
Second, the amount of money we might raise, even if there's not a retaliation, will not pay the debt down very much. I don't know how much we're talking about here, but let's 10 billion, 20 billion. I have no idea. I think those numbers are probably wild overestimates, but we're not going to even make a rounding error on the deficits. And fundamentally, if somebody came into my town, and it doesn't matter who they are, where they're from, could be from the next city or could be from a different country, and they want to sell me a product for a really inexpensive price, and it's a product I want to buy, we don't want to discourage that. Like, right? If somebody, it's a good thing. I want high quality things for a cheaper price. Or sometimes, maybe you'd say, well, it's not high quality. Well, sometimes maybe I'd rather have a lower quality option for a cheaper price, as many of us do. It's don't restrict our freedom.
It just seems like the target is got to bring down inflation, got to bring down. Everybody's up in arms about inflation. And the way to do that on the trade policy is to lower tariffs, is to increase the amount of trade so that we can get more inexpensive things in this country. I mean, I'm not worried about losing jobs to overseas for lower, I'm not worried about any of that stuff. There are things that there are still lots of jobs in America. The unemployment rate is still really, really low. I'm worried about inflation, and this is not in any way going to help that.
Matt, I looked it up for you because I was curious while you were talking. The United States imports roughly a little over $500 billion from China. So assuming that we just actually increased it 10%, right? We did a 10% tax and like literally nothing changed, it'd be $5 billion, which
Or
people are going to
50.
listen to that and go, that's a lot of money.
That's 50
That's
billion.
50
nothing.
billion, but
50 billion, sorry, yeah, 50 billion.
Which is
That's
still nothing.
That's
And-
nothing
yeah.
for a $6 trillion economy. 50 billion is nothing. But right, it's assuming nothing happens. I think it goes back to what we said earlier. Competition is largely what brings prices down. Whether you think about it from a domestic policy with all the executive orders that he put out, that he didn't talk about trying to increase competition, we don't need increased competition against China in the sense that we're making more stuff. It can just be that we get more options of what we can purchase, that we can purchase cheaper products, smaller products, alternative products. If they're cheaper, that's how you bring down prices. Make the American companies compete with Chinese companies.
Mhm.
the one spot on here that I agreed with Trump on during his presidency and in the statement was the regulation cuts. He was very, very big on, if a new regulation goes in place, we need to cut two at the same time. And at the very least, that meant we weren't seeing a net increase in regulations going on during that. And I wish every president had a similar policy to that. That is one thing that I think he actually did incredibly well that I don't know of any other president in my lifetime that has done as well on that single front. He mentioned that we're going to be bashing both of these people on most things, but I want to give credit for that. I'm curious if either of you disagree with me on that one.
No, I know he talks about this later also in the debate, so I didn't make a note of it in this particular statement, but yeah, I mean you want to reduce regulations, you can reduce regulations in a lot of different ways. One of the ways you can reduce regulation is to make it easier to trade with other countries.
You're not wrong.
Like, all right, man, you're taking one step forward and two steps back, it seems like, with some of these policies.
We move on to the next clip.
And according to a new nonpartisan analysis, President Trump, your administration approved $8.4 trillion in new debt, while so far, President Biden, you've approved $4.3 trillion in new debt. So, former President Trump, many of the tax cuts that you signed into law are set to expire next year. You want to extend them and go even further, you say. With the U.S. facing trillion-dollar deficits and record debt, why should top earners and corporations pay even less in taxes than they do now?
Because the tax cuts spurred the greatest economy that we've ever seen just prior to COVID. And even after COVID, it was so strong that we were able to get through COVID much better than just about any other country. But that tax spurred. Now, when we cut the taxes, as an example, the corporate tax was cut down to 21% from 39%, plus beyond that. We took in more revenue with much less tax, and companies were bringing back trillions of dollars back into our country. The country was going like never before, and we were ready to start paying down debt. We were ready to start using the liquid gold right under our feet, the oil and gas right under our feet. We were going to have something that nobody else has had. We got hit with COVID. We did a lot to fix it. I gave him an unbelievable situation. And I'd love to ask him, and will, why he allowed millions of people to come in here from prisons, jails, and mental institutions to come into our country and destroy our country.
President Trump, we will get to immigration later in this block. President Biden, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to this question about the national debt.
He had the largest national debt of any president in a 4-year period, number one. Number two, that $2 trillion tax cut benefited the very wealthy. What I'm going to do is fix the tax system. For example, we have 1,000 trillionaires in America. Billionaires in America. And what's happening? They're in a situation where they, in fact, pay 8.2% in taxes. If they just paid 24%, 25%, either one of those numbers, they'd raise $500 billion, I should say, in a 10-year period. We'd be able to wipe out his debt. We'd be able to help make sure that all those things we need to do, child care, elder care, making sure that we continue to strengthen our health care system.
Well, he's right. He did beat Medicare. He beat it to death, and he's destroying Medicare because all of these people are coming in. They're putting them on Medicare. They're putting them on Social Security. They're going to destroy Social Security. This man is going to single-handedly destroy Social Security. These millions and millions of people coming in, they're trying to put them on Social Security. He will wipe out Social Security. He will wipe out Medicare. So he was right in the way he finished that sentence, and it's a shame.
Okay. Hey, so we had some comments. What do we think about Trump and Biden's comments here on the economy, on the debt, on the billionaire taxes?
Brian, let me go first.
Please.
Let me go first on this.
Please.
Listen, you're going to have way more to say on this. This is where I'm going to share my frustration with. I think there's been an echo of this throughout everything we've talked about. It's not just presidents that are running the country. There is a Congress that has to create a budget and has to be approved to go to a president. And yes, presidents absolutely, right? They sign those budgets. They sign the plans. Like, the president matters. I get so frustrated, especially when I'm going to pick on one like this that I think is more closely tied to who's in Congress. When we think about things like taxes, tax rates, changing the tax code, how much is being spent, a lot of this was also supported by Congress. And I think there's too much blame on presidents, not enough blame on the Congress for the things that are happening. So, Brian, you're the macro guy. I'm going to let you've been teaching macro, so I'm going to let you talk about the debt and the deficit. But I think it's always driven me insane, especially when representatives and senators stand up complaining about debt. And I'm like, that's your job to fix that. Like, so Brian, take it away.
So there's a lot here that they only have 2 minutes to talk about. Okay, so granted that, but Trump is obviously trying to make the Laffer curve case that we cut taxes and increased revenue, and I'll give him that. I don't know if it's true. I'm just going to say yes. However, in a basic, anytime you look at profits, there's the revenue side and there are the cost side. So you've got to incorporate the cost, and even if revenues are going up, you're going to have an increase in your deficits if your costs are also going up. So maybe you do increase your revenues, but you're not controlling costs in any way. And it's, this is really frustrating for someone who, and I have listened to Republicans say for years and years and years, you can trust us, we're going to cut government, we're going to cut government. And if you look at the data, I think it's every time Republicans have control of House and the White House and the legislature, the deficits get bigger than if it's a Democrat, if Democrats hold them both. It's a remarkable just juxtaposition of this is what we say and this is what happens. And part of it is they cut their revenues, and part of it is that they spend just as much as Democrats, and a lot of times more. They just spend it in different ways. Mm-hmm. So, I wish I could remember who said this at some point, but people want their government to spend money. They do not want their government to spend less. People want their government to collect less, and when governments collect less and spend more, you're always going to have bigger deficits and larger debt. I'm looking at a debt to GDP ratio list here, and the United States is not nearly as bad as some countries, but there are just about 190 countries that are better than the United States when it comes to debt to GDP ratio. We're different than other countries, so we are not, we're not Tunisia. The fact that our debt to GDP ratio is almost twice as high as Tunisia's isn't, that doesn't matter as much, but we're a lot closer to Greece and Sudan and Italy than we are to some of these other countries. And this is going to have ramifications when it comes to inflation. As rating agencies look at the debt to GDP ratio, they're not going to continue to give. They haven't continued to give the U.S. the same ratings for debt, and so interest rates start to climb that the government has to pay. We have so much debt, and any minuscule increase in the interest rate is going to have just devastating consequences on budgets for the future. So this is, the idea that nobody wants to really reduce the deficit no matter what they say has long-term and I think really important and underestimated impacts on what the future looks like. It's not good, and neither party is in any way. Neither party cares about this really.
In many ways, it's probably the most troubling thing going on right now, I think, with politics, which is this big statement. I mean, it's a huge statement, but there is no plan to reduce the deficits. We're over $1 trillion in interest. And if you divide that out by the 333 million, that's like $3,000 in interest payments per
Every year.
American every single year. That means higher taxes or fewer services. That's going to shrink economic growth. And nobody wants to talk about that. And that part's very, very troubling.
So Trump said in there, he was talking about how, everything was going great. And then they were ready to start paying down the debt. They had collected all this extra revenue and they were ready to start paying down the debt. And that's a classical, sorry, I shouldn't use the word classical. That is a Keynesian, statement that, hey, when times are good, we pay down the debt. And, in theory, it looks beautiful. I tell my students this all the time when we talk about Keynesian, policy and how it's supposed to work, this counter-cyclical policy where when things are bad, you spend more, when things are good, you spend less, and you collect more in taxes and you pay back your bills. But nobody ever does that. And that statement that we were ready to start paying down the debt, it's like, no, come on, don't insult my intelligence. That's just a foolish statement.
The moderator said this, and the moderator was correct about the levels of the spending. But I've seen economists say, come on, Trump increased the debt by more than Biden. What are you talking about? Well, the first 3 years Trump was in office, the deficits were lower each year than any of the years Biden has been in office. It really went up dramatically in 2020, which that's a rare time I thought big government spending made sense, right? You wanted, if you're telling people to stay home, you've got to figure out a way to make sure people get to eat. So, but people could disagree on that. But the first 3 years, they weren't low though, and they weren't dropping. It was looking at this, it was 671 billion, then 1.27 trillion, then 1.2 trillion. So it had actually gone up from 2017 to 2018, 2019, and then the huge spike in the COVID year. And for Biden, one thing to say is how much of his deficits are a remnant from the COVID spending. I'm sure some of it is. I don't know how much of it is, but Biden's have been little under 1.5 trillion, then 1.4 trillion, and then 2.24 trillion.
I mean, the American Rescue Plan was huge, right? That 2021 year was, I guess you could essentially lump those two together, right? 2020 under Trump, 2021 under Biden. Those are essentially their 2 COVID years that are going to just have massive debt spending. Let me defend debt for just a tiny little bit. Not all debt is bad, right? So I think there is good debt. You spend some money to build a bridge, build roads, invest in infrastructure. That's good debt spending. But having a debt because of a deficit, just because you want to spend money on other things, that's the troublesome part. Is that I feel like we're adding to the debt, but not because necessarily of investments. Right? We're not necessarily investing in things that are going to pay off over 30, 40, 50, 60 years. We're spending a lot of money, and we're not collecting very much, right? Like I think it's Chris Clark on Twitter who says this all the time, is that living paycheck to paycheck is not a comfortable position, but there's 2 reasons people might live paycheck to paycheck, and it's your expenses are way too high and you don't make enough money, or you are spending all your money because your paycheck is really, really high. And so it can go on both sides. And I exactly what you said, Matt. I think that to me, the debt part is the most concerning stuff. Is, I look at all the other stuff and I get that, my position and situation is very different than the rest of the American economy. But this is concerning for a long time, right? Inflation is concerning now. I feel confident that we'll get back to where we need to be. The debt, I don't feel confident at all that any president is ever going to turn around and say, put in an austerity measure and actually say, we're going to get this down. I don't.
Yeah,
And again, I'm picking on the president because I don't think the Congress wants that either. Whoever's in charge is going to want to be the ones that, look, we're taking care of exactly what Brian said, whichever group we care about. Look how much we're spending for you. I don't see it changing.
and I don't know that we need to pay the debt down. I think in terms of what would be a goal over the next 5 to 10 years, could we ever get the deficit? If the deficit's at zero and we grow as an economy, the debt keeps getting smaller. And that would be okay. Want to shift over to the comment on the billionaire and the tax rates. This is something the Washington Post has done a post on January, basically a fact check saying that's not correct. But taxing more for billionaires, is that going to pay off the debt? It's going to work just as well as the tariffs on China, right?
Well, no, there's just not enough billionaires. I mean, that's just a crazy. It's just a I don't understand numbers. That's what that statement is.
No, I think that's the Democratic version of the tariffs on China, right? It's the idea that don't worry, you don't have to pay it. We're going to make somebody else pay it. And for Trump, it's we're going to make the Chinese pay it. And for Biden, it's we're going to make those millionaires and billionaires pay it.
Yeah.
It's not going to make a significant difference. Like whether it's I think he had recommended like we're at a 1% one-time tax that would collect a ton of money. We have long-term problems when it comes to debt and deficits. I don't think it makes a difference, right? It's yes, you'll collect some money. They'll come up with ways to avoid it.
They'd collect a bit.
Sorry, Jerry, and that's I think that's a kind of a throwaway line, but a really important throwaway line that they will find ways to get around paying it. And when you have a tax code that doesn't just say, here's how much you make, here's your rate, pay this amount. When you have, whatever, millions of pages of tax code, the millions of pages exist because we're going to create ways to help you get around paying these taxes. And that gets back to the Congress who passes the tax code, who create these loopholes because some friend of theirs or some contributor says, hey, we don't really want to pay taxes because nobody wants to pay taxes. That's just, you live in a civil society, you've got to pay taxes.
The 8% number, though, it's using unrealized gains in wealth. And then what taxes are you paying in total on the change in unrealized gains in wealth? So if you've had a good 401, like if your 401k went up last year by some amount, you didn't pay taxes on it because it's in their retirement account. You pay taxes on your earned income that year. The 8% rate is saying, oh yeah, billionaires had an increase in, say, their stock portfolio or the companies that they owned, and they didn't pay taxes on that because they hadn't sold yet. That's where the 8% number comes from. So it's not I think that's a bit of a disingenuous number.
I looked it up for you. The New York Times actually came out with, so Gabriel Zuckman, like 3 months ago, came out and put they actually charted all the stuff. The top 400 richest Americans are billionaires, pay 23% in taxes, which is exactly what he said he wanted them to pay. Like they pay what he asked them to pay. Could they pay more? That's a different debate. That's not what he said, but exactly what you said, right? It's sort of unrealized gains, realized gains. You raise the taxes on them. Just I'm not gonna cash that in till later. Like it's not gonna make a difference. Like it's not a broad enough policy.
President Biden,
on to
while
the next.
Black unemployment dropped to a record low under your presidency, Black families still earned far less than white families. Black mothers are still 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes, and Black Americans are imprisoned at 5 times the rate of white Americans. What do you say to Black voters who are disappointed that you haven't made more progress?
They acknowledge they made a lot of progress, number one. The fact of the matter is there's more small Black businesses that have been started than any time in history. Number two, the wages of Black unemployment is the lowest level it's been in a long, long time. Number three, we're providing housing for Black Americans. and dealing with the segregation that exists among these corporations that collude to keep people out of their houses. And in addition to that, we find that the impact on the choice that black families have to make relative to child care is incredibly difficult. When we did the first major piece of legislation in the past, I was able to reduce black child care costs. I cut them in half. We got to make sure we provide for child care costs. We got to make sure, because when you provide those child care protections, you increase economic growth because more people can be in the job market. So there's more to be done, considerably more to be done. But we've done a great deal so far, and I'm not letting up, and they know it.
You have 49 seconds left. What do you say to black voters who are disappointed with the progress so far?
I say I don't blame them for being disappointed. Inflation is still hurting them badly. For example, I provided for the idea that any black family first-time home buyer should get a $10,000 tax credit to be able to buy their first home so they can get started. I made sure that we're in a situation where all those black families and those black individuals who had to take out student loans that were ballooning, that if they were engaged in nursing, doctor, and anything having to do with volunteerism, if they paid their bills for 10 years on their student debt, all the rest is forgiven after 10 years. Millions have benefited from that. And we're going to do a whole lot more for black families.
Thank you, President Trump.
And he caused the inflation. He's blaming inflation, and he's right, it's been very bad. He caused the inflation, and it's killing black families and Hispanic families and just about everybody. It's killing people. They can't buy groceries anymore. They can't. You look at the cost of food where it's doubled and tripled and quadrupled. They can't live. They're not living anymore. He caused this inflation. I gave him a country with essentially no inflation. It was perfect. It was so good. All he had to do is leave it alone. He destroyed it with his Green New scam.
If you look at black unemployment rates, they're really low for Biden. I mean, they went down a lot from 2010. If you look at the data, I mean, it's not straight down, but it is. What does it goes from
Steep.
like 16.8 down to 5.3 before COVID, and then it bounces like everything else, and then it's down to that 5.3, 5.4, 5.6 range again. I think Biden's right about black unemployment rates being low. It's the trend that's happened over the last 15 years that's I think being observed there, except for that.
I mean, it's the same trend as the national unemployment rate, right? The national one was constant down. I'll give Trump credit. I think when you think this is a huge issue, when we think about just different ethnic groups and racial groups and how their unemployment rates differ from white Americans. I mean, it's historic. Like this is not a Trump versus a Biden thing. This has been true for decades, that the black unemployment rate has always been higher than the white unemployment rate. They tend to move in the same direction, but they don't. I mean, they very rarely converge. I think Trump made a very good point that got left out. The unemployment rate has always been this bad. But when we look at things like household wealth, household income, those things are also much lower. And the inflation rate is hitting those families much harder. The food prices have not tripled or quadrupled. That's very wrong. They are up higher than the regular inflation rate. They're up 25% since the start of the term. 25% is not quadruple. But if you're seeing
so close to though, I mean, anybody could have made that mistake.
1/4, 4/1. It's reciprocal, right? So
yeah.
But I'd say that's the thing, is that's where I would focus it, right? And this I always think, like, if I was a politician, what would I say? The unemployment rate is bad. It's historically been bad. But when you think about things like wealth and income for minority groups in America, they earn much less than white Americans. Inflation is hitting them harder when you don't earn as much. When food is 25% more, if you earn more, you can absorb more of that increase. When you don't earn very much, the percentage that you spend on food is much higher than other groups. And so when food inflation is up, it hits you much harder. I think there are more pressing concerns than the unemployment rate. We have a low unemployment rate. It could be, yes, it can be lower, that's not the biggest issue facing different groups of people in this country. It's inflation, right? It's rental prices, it's childcare prices. I think he did a really good job highlighting those portions. How much is Biden responsible for that?
Yeah.
It goes back to what we've been saying the whole episode.
What can be done on childcare?
Well, part of it's demand and supply. I mean, I know people who have their kids in childcare say they can't find
Mhm.
reliable childcare, and it's a supply issue, just like housing. And part of the supply issue is that if you go and take those jobs, you are not getting paid much. And I know
No.
as someone who, when I walk into a room or I walk into a restaurant or I walk into anywhere where there are little kids, I I just I can't deal with little kids. I've raised 3 kids and I'm glad they're not little anymore. And I'm glad they don't have little friends anymore. Uh, people people in that business, you can't pay them enough. And the problem is you can't pay them enough because people don't either can't afford to pay for childcare or
Yeah.
they're like, surely I can find someone cheaper. It's a low skill job, but it's a low skill job that you can't just have anybody do because, if it's me, I'm going to lose my temper in 13 seconds when I'm dealing with a little kid. And then I'm going to either end up in jail or fired or both. I don't have that skill.
And people want to put their kids in daycares where there's high teacher to student ratio, right? Low student to teacher ratio, right? You want a daycare provider who has very few kids so they can watch your kid carefully. That's expensive, right? It is very expensive, right? It's you need scale, but I think it's the same supply issue. Actually, that's really good that I think you linked it to housing. I hadn't even thought about that. It's a heavy supply issue, right? You need to get more people in those areas doing those jobs in order to supply more affordable options. But exactly what Brian said is the more affordable it gets, that's less money that those people are going to end up making, which means they're not going to want to do it. You get this really sticky market, I think.
I don't know of. I've heard people talk in the past. Oh, we need to get childcare expenses down for families, and I've never known what to do. Do you want to provide a subsidy for families who are putting their kids in childcare? But of course, that'll increase the demand for childcare, which will offset some of it. I'm talking off the top of my head. I haven't really thought of this much. If I was really thinking about a policy, would it be to try to subsidize people who work in childcare? I mean, if you really want to do it, are you like, hey, if you work in childcare, we'll give you extra money, which, I mean, throws in all of the, I mentioned how I like less regulations. This goes opposite of that, of course. Is that, I don't know what necessarily to do. That's why I asked the question. This wasn't one where I kind of think I have an idea on what to do. I don't really know.
I think the two that you recommended are very popular ones. There's other people who argue that there's too much regulation. It's too hard to open a daycare, too hard to become a childcare provider. I can't imagine that that's a sector that would ever see a reduction in licensing and regulation.
Yeah.
Very few people are going to be like, yeah, let's make it. I mean, it would be great if it was easier, but I think people are, no, we need standards for childcare. Yeah. You don't want to drop your kid off at an unlicensed daycare. That sounds terrifying to a parent. You're right, Matt. I don't have a good answer. I don't know which side you'd put it on. You could think about things. Maybe you do it in the education space where there's some sort of programs for people who are going through education programs, right? There's, you do funding on the education side. Maybe that cuts some of it. You can lump it in with the student loan stuff. You serve as a teacher for a certain amount of time. You serve as a daycare provider, right? You lump that in. But I think exactly what Brian said, that's not normally a job that you need a college degree for. It's, maybe to be a director, there's some sort of educational component to it. But most workers, I think it's the same problem we see facing healthcare, where healthcare aides are really low paid. That's a physically demanding, exhausting job where a lot of your patients die. People don't want to be in that space. So I don't know how to make that a more pleasant job for people.
Yeah.
His big kill on the black people is the millions of people that he's allowed to come in through the border. They're taking black jobs now, and it could be 18, it could be 19, and even 20 million people. They're taking black jobs, and they're taking Hispanic jobs, and you haven't seen it yet, but you're going to see something that's going to be the worst in our history.
Thank you. President Biden?
There was no inflation when I became president. You know why? The economy was flat on its back. 15% unemployment. He decimated the economy, absolutely decimated the economy. That's why there was no inflation at the time. There were no jobs. We provided thousands of millions of jobs for individuals who are in all communities, including minority communities. We made sure that they have health insurance. We have covered, if the ACA has increased, I made sure that they're $8,000 per person in a family to get written off for health care.
The comments here is it that immigrants are taking the jobs of Americans? How are we rating this claim by Trump?
Adrian?
I was hoping you wouldn't have to pick me first.
Oh, I'll go first.
No, it's okay. I can go first. I'm happy to do it. I taught labor economics. This is always the fun topic when we get to this section. This is a incredibly popular argument for a lot of people. This idea that we have a lump of jobs that are available, that there's a fixed amount of jobs, and you have to substitute. I think it's called the lump of labor fallacy. It's got a really nice name. The problem is that is so misleading. There are studies that have shown there's some substitution happening, especially for low wage jobs, construction work, kind of low wage service jobs. There's some that find that, and then there's other studies that have found the exact opposite, that are nope, that increases job opportunities for people. It helps Americans move up into higher paying positions, sort of where they weren't a manager before, now they're managing immigrant workers who are coming in. This is probably sort of one of those really muddled sort of areas that has some truth to it, but is also, I'd say, usually used in a misleading way, largely focused on this sort of lump of labor idea. People come in, they buy stuff, they need houses, they need groceries, they need services. That creates more jobs later. We have both a sort of a demand and a supply side when it comes to immigration. So I'd say misleading, but there's some truth that I don't want to say no one is impacted, right? That's absolutely not true. Mm-hmm. Somebody, yes, probably was replaced. On a bigger scale, largely immigration is a good thing. It helps provide a lot of things that we wouldn't normally provide for ourselves.
Yeah. So just to put this in context of what we were talking about just a few minutes ago, if all of these immigrants are coming into the country and taking jobs from America, it seems like the unemployment rates that we have seen go down over the last 15 years should not be going down unless there are a whole bunch of people leaving the labor force. And I mean, it would have to be so many millions and millions of people leaving the labor force for the unemployment rate to be going down this much. To me, that's unfathomable. So the idea that immigrants are coming and taking jobs, yeah, there are, like Jadrian, just like you said, there's some substitution that's happening at the margin there somewhere. But it is clear that if we deport a whole bunch of immigrants, there are going to be, the job market is going to be unbelievably unbalanced. The demand will be so much higher than supply that, yeah. So, you go to a hotel or a restaurant now. Recently I've been to places where there's just not enough wait staff. There's not enough people working at the hotels, and that problem is going to be just exponentially worse. The people who are coming into the country are taking jobs that tend, for the most part, I think, especially the illegal immigration, they tend to be low skilled. They tend to be in job sectors where there are lots of openings, and these people are needed in those openings. And it's not just hospitality, it's agriculture. I mean, if you talk to farmers who about this issue, they will tell you, if we don't have these workers, there's going to be so much food just rotting in fields that is not getting picked. And what's that going to do to food prices? That's going to cause food prices to go up even more. So immigration is something that I have come around on a lot over the last 25 years. Let's say 30 years. If you're looking for another Brian to put on the show at some point in time, talk to Brian Kaplan from George Mason. He has some really, really interesting insights on immigration.
Yeah.
He's got this it's not a graphic novel, but it's like a comic book basically on immigration. It's really interesting. Anyway, this is one of those boogeymen that politicians have been using. I will go back, no Irish need apply. That's the one that I like to tell my students about when they say it's always racial. It's not always, black and white. It's oftentimes, European, people who you're taking our jobs, you're taking our jobs.
Yeah.
It's a fallacy, I think, in the United States that needs to be addressed.
No, completely agree. The thinking through the economics behind it, okay, let's say there are some number of jobs, some set number of jobs. Let's just say it's 100 jobs, for a simplified example. And then all of a sudden, somebody comes in from another country and wants a job and gets a job, and a firm decides to hire them. Well, a couple things. One, the firm is hiring them because that's the best deal for the firm. So the firm is now making more money. And with that extra money, that's going back into the economy to potentially hire somebody else. And the person who took the job is making money, which they're spending in the economy. And that also leads to, of course, other jobs. And it's part of the reason why, as you say, right, the number of jobs in this country, it's way more than when it was 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 20 years ago, when our populations were much lower. If it was a set number of jobs, we wouldn't see this. And it doesn't mean there can't be some transitional bumps for some individuals. That certainly can happen and does happen. But in the long run, more people are employed, but those people then have money and they're going to spend the money. And the firms are hiring whoever they're hiring because that's the best person they can find. So they're making increased profits, which then, they're either spending or reinvesting. So the idea that it's a zero-sum game for employment is completely wrong. And I also agree with you on the inflation comments. We would see higher inflation if we have more restrictions. And it doesn't mean I don't think some things, it's off of econ a little bit. Some of what seems to be happening isn't ideal. And there's some, some of the, as they're saying, it's called the border crisis in some ways. They've got to figure something out on some of this, but in terms of what it's doing on the economy, yeah, completely.
Well, Matt, I can add, even if it's going back to sort of the econ side of it, even if you think about it as hiring a worker who is cheaper and that's more profit for them, it could also just as easily be that you hire someone cheaper and then you lower prices for your products. And now you're more competitive against all your other people who are not doing that. And so when you go back to this idea of inflation, that's another one of those places where restricting immigration into the country is going to raise inflation, is going to make prices higher. That you're not getting the result that you think you're getting by doing that. So it's challenging, right? Brian, I think you kicked it off with this, is, man, we really need more people to have an economics education, to think about these sorts of relationships of, how does it, just the thought process, right? How does it, if I do this, then I do this, how does this affect prices, output, employment? No, this is one that I think I used to tell this to my students all the time. There's a handful of things that economists largely agree on, as a mass. Usually, it's tariffs are bad and immigration is good. Everything else, we can kind of debate back and forth. What's the right tax rate? Should we subsidize one side versus the other side? Should we not do it? But I mean, immigration and trade, they're both sort of the same idea. It's trading products versus trading people. It's that same sort of concept that's at play.
Sounds good. Let's move to the next clip.
Struggle just to make ends meet. For many older Americans, Social Security provides a critical lifeline. President Biden, if nothing is done to Social Security, seniors will see their benefits cut in just over 10 years. Will you name tonight one specific step that you're willing to take to keep Social Security solvent?
Yes, make the very wealthy begin to pay their fair share. Right now, everybody making under $170,000 pays 6% of their income, of their paycheck, every single time they get a paycheck, from the time the first one they get when they're 18 years old. The idea that they're going to, I'm proposing that the millionaires pay 1%. 1%. So no one I would not raise the cost of Social Security for anybody under $400,000. After that, I began to make the wealthy begin to pay their fair share by increasing from 1% beyond to be able to guarantee the program for life.
A lot to unpack on that last clip. Who wants to start?
So I'll start on this. The idea of trying to save Social Security by raising taxes on the rich, and the rich aren't paying their fair share. Here's my interpretation of that. And I think what Biden was saying has to do with average tax rates. So, your average tax rate up until a point for Social Security is that 6.2%. Beyond that, your average tax rate goes down. So when he's saying the millionaires are paying 1% for Social Security, that's the average tax rate because they stop paying Social Security taxes after whatever the cap is every year. The cap changes every year. So I think that's what he's talking about. And so I think his proposal is to get rid of the cap on Social Security tax, which means that everybody would pay 6.2% on every dollar that they earn. So the marginal tax rate would be 6.2% for everybody. And in that case, you would definitely bring more money in to pay for Social Security. This is one of those tax policies I think I understand why they do it, but I think it's a remnant of when Social Security started to get it passed. I think there were probably a lot of people who said, I don't need Social Security. I don't want government taking more tax money out of my paycheck. And so I think the idea of putting a cap in on Social Security was to say, basically, look, if you aren't going to use Social Security, if you don't need it as much as somebody else, you don't have to pay for it. So we'll tax people up to a certain level, but after that, you don't pay any additional tax.
It's interesting. I always had thought it was the idea that this would not be a welfare program in the sense you get it because you pay in, and it's capped at a certain amount. So even though if you make up to the cap, like if you make over the 170,000 cap, you're going to be paying in the maximum possible into Social Security because you stop paying. And you will get the maximum possible, but your rate of return is way lower. The wealthy get a lower rate of return on Social Security than poor do. It's not just in the way that it's set up. So that's always the way it's always the way I understood in terms of why it's set up that way. I think you raise a good point, though. I mean, that's one way floated to raise revenue. That's a different interpretation to what I had on what he was recommending. My take on what he was recommending, and I could be wrong, was there'd be there's the Social Security as it sits now. And then once you make $1 million, then there is 1% on every dollar you make over $1 million that you're also being taxed. That's the way I interpreted it, which I could be wrong. And that also would be consistent with him saying over and over, nobody who makes under 400,000 will see a penny of tax increases. Jadrian, how did you interpret the comments?
I couldn't understand.
Okay.
This is one where I think it goes back to what Brian said. There are certain policies that I don't fully understand. And it feels like every politician has a different way of handling Social Security and how they're going to fund it. And none of them fully make sense to me on what they think it's going to do. So I will say I have no idea. And while you were saying that, I was trying to Google to see if there was a White House briefing that actually answered that. But my guess is probably there's not going to be.
Yeah. Something will have to change. And the thing that will have to change is the retirement age will have to be raised. The benefits that are given will have to be reduced. Likely that if that happens, it would be slightly lower COLAs. I can't imagine cost of living adjustments. I can't imagine they're literally going to say, oh yeah, all of a sudden we're going to cut everybody unless things get really ugly. Or there will have to be more taxes going into the system. One of those three, unless some major demographic shift happens that we are not expecting, one of those things will have to happen. I don't see any other alternatives. And I would think it will likely be some combination of more than one of those that would end up happening.
I mean, I think the easy answer, it needs to be more than one, right? We can't have, I think that's the problem is each person always picks one side of the thing to target. They're like, oh, we're not going to change cost of living adjustments, how much we're paying. We're only going to do taxes. Like you need both. Realistically, like you can't sort of expect to get what you want out of both of it.
I heard
Or by
somebody
just
talking.
doing like one side.
I heard someone talking about this earlier today, and they referred back to the last time there was this major crisis point for Social Security. It was back in '83. And one of the things that they did was to start to tax federal employees for Social Security, because it used to be that if you worked for the federal government, you didn't pay Social Security tax. And so now they do. And that helped to stave off this crisis cliff that they were heading towards with Social Security. But you can't do that again. So you can't now tax the federal employees again because they're still paying taxes. It's not like you're going to double taxes on federal government employees. So I think the question, or I think a solution, is that you need more workers. And where do the new workers come from? Well, they come from other countries. So I think if you can fix the immigration process to make it more efficient so that people can get into the country more easily and go into work, then if they're not working in the underground economy, they're going to be paying Social Security tax. That's not a terrible thing.
Is that a wrap? Is this a long enough episode, or do we need to add any extra time? Thank you to everybody for tuning in. Any pop culture you want to bring up in terms of anything related to the debate or anything else?
We have made them listen to enough stuff. I'm not going to make them listen to my voice for any longer.
Yeah.
The fact that they made it to this point in the episode, they deserve a break.
Yeah. Send us if you make it here and you want stickers, which is right now our current swag. We are talking about increasing the swag collection. And we're also, Jadrian and I have talked about adding actually a paid option, which you could get some swag, but that would actually help us hire some student workers to perhaps get this out a little bit more regularly for those who might want to put in a small amount of support. But as of now, it's stickers. But if you made it here, you want us to send some stickers in the mail, we will be thrilled to send you some Economics Happy Hour stickers. So any closing words of wisdom, thoughts? Jadrian's shaking no. Brian?
I got none. I need a coffee refill.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. Please like and subscribe. We will be back to you soon with our more traditional episodes that aren't as long and not covering a presidential debate. But we appreciate everybody for being here. And Jadrian, Brian, cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.